It is the Resistance Report for March 22nd, 2017. Good evening. A couple of leading issues tonight, and again, our goal is to show you how things are connected to other things and also provide some context. Number one, there's going to be a vote tomorrow on the House bill, Paul Ryan's contribution to repealing and so-called replacing the Affordable Care Act. We're calling it Trump Care because Donald Trump has put his office, his reputation, his presidency behind this bill. I believe that Paul Ryan snookered Donald Trump, because why in the world would Donald Trump do that when not only do we know from the Congressional Budget Office that 16 million people are going to be losing their coverage next year if this is passed, and 24 million people over the next 10 years, but also there just aren't the votes for it. It's going to be a squeaker. If it does go through the House tomorrow, it's going to just barely make it, and there are already 4 Republican senators who say they are going to vote against it if and when it gets to the Senate. So here we have Donald Trump staking his entire presidency, his reputation, on something that is pathetic, sad, to use a word that Donald Trump likes to use, that may not get through the House, almost certainly is not going to get through the Senate. And he did not, Donald Trump, do what any normal, thoughtful, thinking president would do, certainly a strategic president, and that is to say to Paul Ryan, no, I want to do my infrastructure plan first, or I want to do my tax cut, corporate tax cut first, or I want to do something that has to do, arguably, with jobs first. But no, Paul Ryan snookered Donald Trump into doing this loser first. Now, if Donald Trump loses this vote, as I said yesterday, he's not going to lose the vote in the House tomorrow, because if they don't have enough votes, if they're going to be counting noses, if they don't have enough votes, they're going to put this off to Friday or next week until they do think they have enough votes in the House. The real problem is the Senate. And if he loses this in the Senate, that is going to be a huge loss with regard to his credibility, because this is the first big legislative attempt he's making. Now, you and I both know it's nuts. It's crazy. Why would he possibly do this? Because it's not at all in the interest of the United States and Americans. But put that to one side. We know that. The real issue here is his own political strategy. It makes no sense. He's about to lose the small amount of credibility he has, which is tonight's theme. It is Donald Trump's limited and constrained and declining credibility, political credibility. The Wall Street Journal today, in an editorial, which I urge you to read. I normally don't urge you to read the Wall Street Journal, do I? If you can get a hold of this editorial, I urge you to read it. It is on this Facebook page, if you are looking at my Facebook page. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it because it's indicative of where things have come for Donald Trump. Now remember, this is the Wall Street Journal. This is big business and Wall Street. This is the voice of corporate America. This is what it has come to. The Wall Street Journal says, Trump's repeated lack of respect for the truth puts him in jeopardy of being viewed as a fake president. Again, this is Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal editorial board. I'm going to read that again. Trump's repeated lack of respect for the truth puts him in jeopardy of being viewed as a fake president. This week, the editorial goes on, should be dominated by smooth political sailing for Trump's Supreme Court nominee and health care reform. That's the way the Wall Street Journal talks about it. But the week has been dominated by news that Trump was repudiated by his own FBI director. And listen to this. This is the way the the Wall Street Journal ended its editorial. Trump, quote, clings to his assertion that Obama wiretapped him like a drunk to an empty gin bottle, unquote. Now think about that image, and think about it coming from the staid, stolid, conservative, Republican Wall Street Journal editorial board. Trump clings to his assertion that Obama wiretapped him like a drunk to an empty gin bottle. Now, what does that mean when the Wall Street Journal comes out with that kind of an editorial? Well, what it means is Donald Trump is on probation. The American business community, big business, Wall Street, Rupert Murdoch, all of that wealth, all that power, that entire side of the Republican Party, the patrons of the Republican Party, are putting Donald Trump on notice that he may be in danger, in fact, is in danger of losing their support. They are beginning to catch on to the fact that Donald Trump has no character or temperament that belongs in the White House. Donald Trump is a menace. He's an embarrassment. Republicans thought, and this is true of the business side of the Republican Party as well, they thought when Donald Trump was elected, well, he'll provide us with cover. We can get through all of the corporate tax cuts and all of the regulatory reductions that we've been wanting for years. We can get rid of all of the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. We can get rid of anything that weighs us down and costs us money so that our corporate profits, which are already extraordinarily huge, going through the sky, through space, through the universe, those profits and the share prices that accompany them already very high, but we in the business community of America, we think, or we thought, that Donald Trump, despite all of his bravado, despite his character flaws, he will provide us with cover to get all this done. What they are discovering, and this editorial is the proof, what they are discovering is the bravado, the carelessness, the unhinged Donald Trump is actually making it harder, not easier, for them to get done what they wanted to do. The talk among Republicans at that level, now I don't have any particular moles to tell me this, but I can tell you that I can read between the lines. The talk among the business elite, Wall Street elite, the patrons of the Republican Party right now, is that Mike Pence would make a much better president. And several of them are saying to themselves and to each other, you know, if Donald Trump goes down, that's not such a bad thing. My attitude is, if Donald Trump goes down, that's not such a bad thing. Some of you may feel differently, but I am of the view that it's better to have Michael Pence, a right-winger, even a vicious right-winger, who has at least a brain, in the White House, in the Oval Office, than a sociopath who is nuts. Along that line, let me just say, today another piece of news. Paul Manafort, we've talked about Paul Manafort before, he was the campaign manager for Donald Trump. An AP story, Associated Press story today, says that beginning in 2006, Paul Manafort was getting $10 million a year, and this continued up until at least 2009. We know that Manafort was helping the Russians in Ukraine. What we didn't know until today, and this AP story is authenticated, they say that they have authentication. AP, the Associated Press, is not some marginal group. This is a major, one of America's major news organizations, one of the major world news organizations. The AP says it has authenticated evidence that one of the three oligarchs closest to Putin, in other words, an alter ego of Putin, was actually hiring $10 million a month, actually a year, was hiring Paul Manafort to represent Putin's interests in all of the former Soviet republics. In other words, he was doing not only in Ukraine, he was doing it all over the former Soviet republics, and he was doing it for Putin. And what was he doing? He was actually elevating Putin's stature. He was engaging in propaganda efforts. He was engaging in surreptitious efforts. He was engaging in something that sounds, now the AP didn't say this, I am making some conclusions now, sounds remarkably similar to what Russian operatives did in the United States on Trump's behalf in the 2016 election. That is, interfere. Paul Manafort was getting, remember, $10 million a year from Putin for interfering in the former Soviet republics' elections, spewing propaganda on behalf of Putin. You see the parallels. This is getting closer and closer and closer. The noose is tightening. That Wall Street Journal editorial today is a reflection of the business elite in this country knowing that the noose is tightening. The fact that Paul Ryan could snooker Trump so easily is also evidence that Trump's credibility is in decline. The noose is tightening. The firing squad is getting ready. Which brings us to the other news item of the day, and that's Neil Gorsuch, Trump's nominee to be Supreme Court Justice. This is the second day of hearings. Now, what I want to say as clearly as possibly is this. The FBI has made it very clear. James Comey yesterday made it very clear. The FBI is investigating possible Trump collusion and the Trump aides collusion with Russian operatives to interfere in the 2016 election. Now, as James Comey said yesterday, there would not be such an FBI investigation were it not for credible evidence, underline those terms, credible evidence of such collusion. The point is, we have a president who now is being investigated by the FBI because the FBI has credible evidence that that president and his aides, or through his aides, might have attempted to throw the 2016 election in his direction. Why should we allow, or anybody allow, the Senate to go forward with the nomination of anybody that this president, given the cloud, given the question now hanging over that president's head, has nominated? All his nominations to the Supreme Court, any nomination to the Supreme Court, should be held in abeyance until this is cleared up. This should not be a partisan matter. This is not just, and it should not be Democrats, it should be Republicans saying exactly the same thing. Wall Street Journal Republicans are beginning to say something similar. Now, they're not saying it about Neil Gorsuch, they're saying it about Donald Trump overall. But do you want, just let me ask you, do you want somebody who the Wall Street Journal characterizes as somebody clinging to his assertion that Obama wiretapped him like a drunk clings to an empty gin bottle? Do you want a drunk clinging to an empty gin bottle to be nominating the next Supreme Court Justice of the United States, who could be there for 20, 30, 40 years? Extraordinary power? Not just a cabinet officer, I'm talking about a Supreme Court Justice. We don't want drunks with clinging to empty gin bottles, people who have that kind of temperament, nominating Supreme Court justices. And we don't want the Senate to move forward on Supreme Court justices nominated by people who the FBI is investigating with clear and credible evidence of collusion with the Russians over the 2016 election to become elected president. Which gets me to my last point of the evening, and then I'm going to turn to your questions. I believe it is incumbent on all of us, including Democrats, to begin the process of at least talking about the grounds for impeachment of Donald Trump. Now, get out your handy-dandy Constitution of the United States. I'm going to go through these very, very quickly, but I want you to have them on the tip of your tongue because they are at least 4, possibly 5 grounds for impeachment. And we need to start talking this up now. Number 1, the Emoluments Clause of Article 1, Section 9. It says that nobody in high office in the United States, certainly not a president, should be taking money from foreign powers. We know Donald Trump is doing that through his property, through his businesses. Number 2, there is a duty to faithfully execute the laws. Article 2, Section 1. By alleging with no evidence that his proceeding, that the president who came just before him was wiretapping him and doing an impeachable offense thereby, that itself is failing to faithfully execute the laws. That's a violation of Article 2, Section 1. He's restrictions on the freedom of the press, where he says only you and you and you, but you can come in and be part of my press briefing or my press conference, but I don't want anybody who's criticized me. That is a restriction on the freedom of the press that violates the First Amendment to the Constitution. His decision to have a Muslim ban, and that's the way the courts are viewing this, as a Muslim ban on travel to the United States, that is essentially establishing a religious test for entry into the United States. That's establishing a religion, also in violation of the First Amendment. And finally, if there is actually proof that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians to throw the election of 2016, that is a violation of Article 3, Section 3, treason. So there you have 4 and possibly 5 reasons for impeachment. And again, it seems to me it is entirely appropriate at this point in time, if not before, for all of us to be making the case and to be suggesting to our members of Congress that, in fact, a case should be made for impeachment. The articles of impeachment come out of the House of Representatives. The conviction comes out of the Senate. The articles of impeachment traditionally are a set of allegations. They still have to be proved. When the FBI has credible evidence that Trump and his aides have colluded with the Russians to throw the 2016 election, that in itself could be grounds for impeachment in terms of beginning an impeachment process which would look into that credible evidence. All right, your questions. From David Kaila. With the investigatory noose tightening, do you think Trump would initiate military activities somewhere in the world to deflect attention? David, I wouldn't put anything past this president. I certainly hope not. But we need to be very vigilant about the possibility that Trump could do something that would not only deflect attention, but would rally America around him. Next question. Rob Hampshire. Why is Sessions, Jeff Sessions, still leading the Justice Department? Because he lied under oath. Well, I want to reference to you a video that we did that's on this page, this Facebook page, I did with Vox about why Jeff Sessions must step down. Now, Republicans are still in charge of the House and Senate, so that's the simple answer, Rob. That's why Jeff Sessions is not being held accountable. But if the Judiciary Committee, the committee that actually held hearings on his confirmation, had even the slightest integrity, the Republicans on that committee, they would hold some hearings on whether Jeff Sessions did, in fact, lie under oath. There's a lot of evidence he did. In fact, the burden is on him to show why he should not be found to have lied under oath. And maybe, hopefully, they have some integrity. I don't know. Emily Mayer. If Gorsuch is such a mensch, as everyone is saying he's a mensch. I haven't heard the word mensch raised once in his hearings. Emily, if Gorsuch is such a mensch, as everyone is saying he is, why isn't he more embarrassed and bow out? I know I would. You were talking about embarrassed by Trump. Well, I think the whole nomination, his whole nomination was embarrassing. I'm talking about Gorsuch's. I mean, the idea of going to Washington, standing behind a curtain, like a contestant in a beauty contest, and then having Trump say, well, I'm going to show you one of my two contestants that I want to be my nominee, making a kind of show out of it, a spectacle out of it, that is demeaning and degrading. If I were Gorsuch, I would have never got to that point. And certainly right now, I would have bowed out. And what you're suggesting, I think, is actually very true. Anybody who will put up with that, maybe that should also be considered a strike against them. Julie Vanderbeck, what is your take on the recent Nunes fiasco? His loyalty to Trump has to disqualify him from leading this investigation, but will it? Julie, you're talking about the House chair of the Intelligence Committee, and you're referring to the fact that he is basically defending Donald Trump every chance he gets, despite what we learned from James Comey's testimony on Monday. The structural problem here is not just Nunes, and it's not just Sessions. It's a broader structural problem. And I want to mention this clearly because many of your questions have to do with this. As long as the Republican Party is in charge of, has a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate, that means that the discipline in those two chambers really originates with the two parties, the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader of the Senate, Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell. They hold all the cards. And so the fact that Jeff Sessions is not being held accountable, the fact that you've got people like Nunes who can basically disregard all of the evidence presented before the committee and come to Trump's aid and defense, is both of those and many other examples simply are symptoms of a more fundamental structural problem, and that problem can only be cured if in 2018, in fact starting before 2018, I'll get to that in a moment, you and everybody you know and a majority of Americans throw them out, the Republicans out. Now, I'm not saying throw every Republican out because there may be some Republicans who actually are willing to stand up to Trump. I'm talking about control of the House and Senate cannot be left up to people who will not stand up to Trump. Next question. Marcia Carlson, what can we do to influence Tillerson and the State Department? I'm very concerned about him not attending NATO, but going to Russia. Does Congress have any influence? Marcia, well, given what I just said, even if Congress had some influence, it's not going to be very influential. But I do think there are certain members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, who could have some impact. John McCain, for example, is very respected in terms of foreign policy. If John McCain issued a statement today saying this is wrong for Tillerson to go to Russia and not go to NATO, and we need to respect NATO, that would have some influence because that would get things stirred up. That would cause the Trump administration to be a little bit defensive. Questions would be raised from the press. How can John McCain say this, and how can you justify what Tillerson is doing? But until we have courageous Republicans who are willing to say this about Tillerson, about the foreign policy of the Trump administration, nothing can change. A president has enormous latitude over foreign policy. Callie Cunningham. During a town meeting I attended a few weeks ago, good for you, Callie, my representative, Darrell Issa, said the statute for allowing an independent prosecutor expired years ago. Is that true? Callie, Darrell Issa, technically, yes, you need a statute to appoint an independent prosecutor, special prosecutor, but that's what I'm talking about. Congress ought to be enacting or reenacting that statute permitting a special prosecutor. Darrell Issa, he says things, and this is not just Darrell Issa, a lot of other Republicans, and some Democrats do as well. They answer questions as if that's the end of the question. What you need to do is follow up and say, well, Republicans are in control of Congress. Why won't Republicans enact a statute enabling a special prosecutor to be appointed? Jennifer Slowey, I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not as optimistic as you are that Trump will be impeached by Congress. What do you think Trump will have to do or say that will cause the yes men and yes women of Congress to stand up and say they've had enough? Jennifer, it all depends on whether they feel that Trump is going to help them in the 2018 midterm elections. We're talking about House members now. Every one of them is up. Or whether they think that Trump is an albatross around their necks. It's getting closer to the point where they are beginning to feel that Trump is a hindrance, an albatross. I can't emphasize the importance of today's editorial in the Wall Street Journal. That is a signal to so many members of Congress, Republicans, that Trump is going to be a problem. When the Wall Street Journal says that about Trump, criticizing Trump in that way, that means the patrons of the Republican Party, the money people in the Republican Party, are getting cold feet about Trump. That is almost invariably going to be felt by the people who receive that money from the patrons of the Republican Party, and I'm talking about members of Congress who are up for re-election in 2018, and senators who will be up for re-election, Republican senators, in 2018 and 2020. They are beginning to get the message. Now you say, I'm optimistic that he's going to be impeached. I don't want to say I'm optimistic he's going to be impeached. I think the likelihood is increasing. But it's not going to happen unless you and millions of other Americans stay active, push hard, Republicans and Democrats. Next question. And we have time for just two more. Corleen, gotta be? I'm still unclear what Ivanka brings to the table. What are her credentials, skill sets, etc.? What is her function? Corleen, Ivanka does not bring, as far as I know, anything to the table except that Donald Trump is comfortable with her, and she maybe can speak truth to power. Maybe she is not intimidated as everybody else is intimidated. Maybe, in fact, Ivanka will be relied upon by others in the White House, which is a seedbed. It's just a kind of a center, a cesspool of intimidation. Maybe they will rely on Ivanka to carry bad news to Trump, who otherwise blows his stack every time he feels that there's any bad news, any criticism from anybody. She is also there to watch his back. Now, I want to say this as clearly as I can. The reason you have anti-nepotism laws, which essentially bar a president from putting his family members around him in the White House, is you don't want somebody in the White House whose allegiance is solely to the reputation and maybe the wealth of the President of the United States. You want people in the White House who have also an allegiance to the United States, to the public. The problem of putting somebody in the White House who is a daughter or a son-in-law, is that their allegiance is only, presumably, to Donald Trump. They don't care. They have not had any public service experience. They don't have no history of being involved in public issues. They don't care, as far as I know, about any of these issues. The only thing they care about is Donald Trump. And that's a problem. Jessica Schindlap, please share a slam dunk of good news. Anything. Jessica, I think that's been I've been chock full of good news today. That Wall Street Journal editorial was pretty good news if you think, as I do, and many of you think, that Donald Trump ought to be out of there. The noose getting tighter and tighter with regard to that new story about Paul Manafort and his closeness to Putin. That is also good news if you believe, as many of us do, that Donald Trump ought to be impeached, because that's one step closer to impeachment. So I've just given you nothing but good news tonight, right? Let me give you other good news, or at least some suggestions. Many of you have asked me the following question. I live in a red district in a Republican area. It's never going to change. I'm not going to change the minds of all my neighbors and people around me. I mean, this is 60, 70, 80% Republican. We're going to go with whoever is up for Congress who is a Republican in the year 2018. So how can I have any influence at all, you ask? Here's how you can have an influence. You can register as a Republican. You and your friends can all become Republicans. You can be progressive Republicans. And you can make sure that in the Republican primary of 2017, you put up somebody who is a progressive, still a Republican, but a progressive Republican. Why shouldn't you do that? Why should you throw your vote away if it's 80, 90, 95% Republican district? Be an active, engaged voter. Become a Republican. You can hold your nose, but at least you can have an influence. These safe districts, these Republican safe districts, are a problem. There should be no safe districts for Republicans or Democrats. So get involved. The other thing I want to remind you of is, if you're not already a member of an indivisible group, please do become a member. There is strength in numbers. There are now over 6,000 separate grassroots, indivisible groups that are organizing and mobilizing to push their members of Congress, and also organizing and mobilizing some of them for the beginnings of the 2018 election cycle. If you want more information as to where your closest indivisible group is, or if you want to start an indivisible group, go to indivisibleguide.com. Indivisibleguide.com, and you can find all of the information there. Last thing, several of you like my book picks. I want to just give you two books that I've read recently that I have found very pertinent and very useful. One book is a book by Harold Holzer and Norton Garfinkel. It's called A Just and Generous Nation. This is about Abraham Lincoln and the fight for American opportunity, but it has very important and interesting implications today. When we talk about opportunity, we talk about the role of the president, we talk about, and you want a positive story? Here's a very positive story. Again, A Just and Generous Nation, Harold Holzer and Norton Garfinkel. It's about Abraham Lincoln, published by Basic Books. One other book suggestion I'm going to give you, and you can tell why this is relevant. This book is called Political Ethics and Public Office. It's by an ethicist named Dennis Thompson. Came out a number of years ago, still as relevant as ever before, published by Harvard University Press. I won't hold that against this book. Not Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley Press, Harvard University Press. You might want to get this. It's in paperback, and it is relevant. It will be important for you to equip yourself with the best arguments you can as to why Donald Trump is behaving unethically. Again, keep it up. Thank you for everything you are doing. Continue to be a citizen activist. Continue to understand, as you do already, but spread the word. These are not normal times. This is not a normal presidency. This is not just business as usual or even partisanship as usual. In fact, this is not and should not be a partisan issue. We have got to move whatever we can to get Donald Trump and his cabinet members and his aides out of the White House as soon as possible. That ends the Resistance Report tonight. See you tomorrow.